Okay, well, thank you for that kind introduction, President Battles, and thank you to Dave for this invitation to speak to you all today. I confess to really admiring the name ASSESStivus, and I'm jealous that you all captured that one before anyone else. What a great name for a conference. So I appreciate your time today. I know we're in the busy part of another busy term. But I'd really like to talk to you all about our work at the moment in the classroom, in higher ed, in what is now the 5th affected semester of the pandemic. And that's very hard to say. It's even harder to think about. But the work that we are doing with students, I think, has become even more important than it was before. And the spotlight that has been cast on some of our teaching strategies and the decisions that we make in the classroom has been, I think, has been made even more urgent than it was certainly pre-pandemic, but even just a few semesters ago. So what I'd like to do today is to talk about a pedagogy of care, compassionate, empathetic, teaching strategies that we can use at this time to benefit our students. But I don't want to forget ourselves as well. And so this is a talk both about caring pedagogies, empathetic pedagogies for students, but also not losing sight of ourselves as faculty and staff and our work in higher education too. So I'm going to start with a couple of polls, actually, to kind of take the pulse of things. For those who are with me in Zoom, I'm putting some information in the chat, and I'm going to bring to the screen. This is the first poll. It is, so if you've used Poll Everywhere before, you're familiar with this, but if you're not, you can see at the top of the screen 2 ways to get into the poll. One is polleb.com/JoshEyler828. And that if you're on a laptop, if you're on a cell phone, you can text Josh Eyler 828 to the phone number 37607. It'll take a second to register that you're in the poll. But once you get in, this is a free response poll. So there are no options to choose from. You're going to type whatever answer you would like to into the box that appears. So what kinds of care and compassion do students need as we enter the 5th semester affected by the pandemic? So I'll give you a few seconds to get in and to think about that. What kinds of care and compassion do students need as we enter the 5th semester affected by the pandemic? Okay, clear structure, clear avenues for time, flexibility, gentleness if they have gaps in their learning. I think that's a very good point. More than ever, recognitions of students as whole people with whole lives. Everyone in higher education as whole people with whole lives. Yes, definitely. Time, understanding, flexibility, patience, check-ins from faculty, clear expectations. Good. Someone to listen, someone to coach, understand, support for mental health. Flexibility is a term that's come up a lot already. It's a pattern that's emerging here. Be willing to view apparent disengagement as a sign of complexity, clear expectations, being human. Yes, all of this, 100%, good. And so the patterns that emerge are, of course, flexibility, and that's flexibility in our work with them. It's flexibility in policies, but it's also an understanding of how flexible it is possible for us to be, and not also ignore the fact that we ourselves are in the midst of a pandemic too. Healthy modeling, that's a nice timing on that one. So that's exactly what I'm talking about. Patience comes up again, thinking about students as full human beings who do not drop their lives off at our classroom door and enter. They come to us with all of everything that they are sort of bringing with them to this. Good, modeling what we need. Excellent. All right, wonderful. So I'm going to move to the next one. Activate that. Good. All right, so same question with a slight spin. What kinds of care and compassion do faculty and staff need as we enter the 5th semester affected by the pandemic? Flexibility again, good. Same stuff, friends. Couldn't have said it better myself. End of keynote. Grace for when we make mistakes. Time to reflect and debrief, which I hope today we can be at least a little bit of space for that. Support, understanding from students. Excellent. Stop asking us for so much service. We only have so much that we can give, so much time. Lots of flexibility. Good. Good communication. Respect for all contributions. Excellent. These are really great points. Again, we're thinking about ourselves here and our ability to do the work of higher ed. Recognition that we are whole people with whole complicated lives. Recognitions of stressors. Absolutely. Personal grace. Good. Notice how many of the answers were the same, right? Time, though. Time is the key. It is the resource that is the finite resource, right? Good. Space to reflect, sympathy, flexibility, loosening restrict expectations. Wonderful. Okay, what I'd like, if someone either who's with us on Zoom or who's in the auditorium, someone who put flexibility as an answer for this, what did you mean by flexibility? What kinds of flexibility would faculty and staff benefit from as it pertains to the work that we're doing right now? You can just unmute, or if you're in the auditorium, go ahead up to the mic. Flexibility. What kinds of flexibility do we need? Someone's putting working from home in the actual poll there. Anyone on Zoom who put that? Okay, someone's chatting. Okay, good. That was Dave saying, feel free to enter into the chat. That's good. Pivot class to remote occasionally, right? For health problems, for work schedule, right? So these are the kinds of flexibility that we need. So there's an emphasis here on working conditions and modality at the same time, right? The conditions under which we are working, healthy conditions, safe conditions, but also the modality we choose and having freedom, some freedom to be able to choose that. Work-life balance, that's a different kind of flexibility, but equally important. Remember that our resources are finite as well. And this is a metaphor that gets overused, but I so think that it's apt. The metaphor of putting on your own oxygen mask before you put on others. That if we are depleted, if we are burned out, if we have nothing left in the tank, it will be very difficult to do many of the things that I'm about to talk about in terms of pedagogies of empathy and care. And so I think that faculty and staff have sort of have maybe been marginalized a little bit in the larger higher ed conversation about the pandemic, but I think we need to bring them to the center with the students in having these conversations. So let all that be kind of a table setting for what we'll talk about today. I'm just going to pull up my presentation right now. All right. Okay. So first, we're going to dive a little bit into the situation in which we find ourselves at this point in the pandemic. And then we're going to talk about pedagogical strategies and then come back to this issue of what do we ourselves need in order to be able to enact these pedagogies successfully. So I think it's really important to acknowledge the conditions that we find ourselves in, to acknowledge how challenging this moment is for everyone in higher education, how difficult it's been, how much loss people feel, the kinds of grief that they feel about what was and what is. And I found this quote about a year ago now, and I think it so nicely captures, I think, a lot of what people are feeling about our work in the classroom. And it's from a K-12 educator, which is why she says children here, but I think the spirit is the same. The students are grieving, as am I. We are in desperate need of someone to tell us it is all right if you cannot operate as your pre-pandemic self. Let us be the voice that tells our students, I see you and I hear you, and it is okay to grieve. what is an education for if not to show students what it means to be human? I love that last line because it captures so much of what I believe about education. But I think the importance of this quote is what occurs at the beginning of it, that we have to be able to acknowledge that this has been difficult and that we are grieving the work that we used to know, the life that we used to know, the situation of higher education that we used to know. And without acknowledging it, without space to process, reflect, and acknowledge, it can be very difficult to move forward and to learn and to be able to kind of take lessons from the last 2 years and apply it going forward. So there has to be space for that kind of reflection, both individually, but also institutionally. Because it's not just grief, it's a compounding of many emotional, psychological factors. It's not true that all of this stops at the end of the semester and then resets at the beginning of the next semester. It's cumulative, and after 5 semesters of it, the burden on students, faculty, and staff and administrators of all of this is significant. The burden that everyone is carrying. And it's not just grief, it's also, as Maysa Maud says in this quote, and she's done some amazingly important work on the neuroscience of trauma and grief during this time, it's also trauma. And we've seen students working through traumatic responses to the pandemic, but faculty also are feeling this. Certainly personally, in navigating the pandemic with family responsibilities or caregiving to parents or other family members, or even just the isolation that the pandemic has brought on. So our own kind of personal traumatic response and the professional, the negotiating the professional domain of teaching and working during the pandemic. But also what she notes here is that faculty may be experiencing what psychologists call secondary traumatic response, because we are working with students who themselves are going through trauma. So you have kind of a piling up factor. In fact, one thing I've noticed with peers who do faculty development work is almost a tertiary traumatic response too, working with faculty who are experiencing trauma, who are themselves working with students. And so this is a piling on. It is a serious thing that we need to be considering as we talk about our work in the classroom, because it's at this point, I find it, as someone who talks about teaching every day and presents to colleagues like yourself often as well, I find it now unethical to talk about effective teaching strategies without also acknowledging the deep trauma and grief of the people doing the teaching and the supporting of students as well. And so we really do need to be thinking about that. So what can we do? As I said, we have to reflect on what we've learned if we hope to move forward. And lots of ways that institutions can do that, but I think it's vital work. And as we do that, we need to keep centering students, faculty, and staff in our practices and our policies. One way is to think about the science of learning, and this is the book that the president referenced a few minutes ago. I cover a lot of different ways that we learn as human beings, but 2 of the ways that the science, I think, has shown to be even more important during the pandemic than I ever realized when I was writing the book, our nature as social creatures, our sociality, and why that is so important to who we are as human beings, but also our learning as well. We are deeply social creatures. We need other people, and that is also true for how we learn most effectively. Our ability to learn on our own, especially in isolation, is far reduced when compared with our ability to learn from and with other people. And the other point, another aspect of this book that I really want to highlight, because it sort of touches on a lot of what I'll talk about over the next few minutes, and that is the science of emotion and learning. That we know 2 things about the connection between emotion and cognition that I think are really important in general, but certainly more important now. One is that the degree to which we can prime positive emotions, students will be able to do the work of our classes more effectively. They'll be able to learn more deeply. A student who feels as if a faculty member cares about who they are as a learner or cares about their work in the class, a student who feels happy to be there, a student who feels invested in the learning community will learn more. On the other side of the emotion coin, as we begin to experience negative emotions to the point where we are no longer able to regulate them, our capacity to perform cognitive tasks diminishes greatly. So another way to put this, as our anxiety goes up, our ability to learn goes down. And I think that has been on full display during the pandemic. And certainly in my work with students, I have seen it. And I think we probably all have seen to some degree that the more a student is stressed, has anxiety, feels worried about something, the less they're able to actually learn. That's rooted in the scientific literature. That's not anecdotal. So I think that that's an important way that we can center students as well. Pedagogically, a lot of the ways that people talk about this have to do with the pedagogy of care, pedagogy of kindness, pedagogy of empathy, lots of different ways to put this. And I want to kind of dive into the what we mean by that. But I first want to say that these strategies that are rooted in empathy, kindness, and compassion and care are often categorized under the rubric of affective labor. This is the emotional labor, care work, and that is work that has historically been undertaken primarily by women faculty members and faculty of color. And what I want to do is to bring that from the margins into the center and to suggest that the pedagogical strategies that we're about to talk about is the work of teaching that everyone needs to be doing in their classrooms. That this is something that everyone needs to take on. That certain of our colleagues do not need to take on that burden by themselves. If you are a teacher in the classroom, this is your work, in other words, right? And so I really want to make that case from the outset. So a pedagogy of care, it's rooted philosophically in a tradition of educational literature that looks at the distinction between caring about something versus caring for something. Now, caring about, we can care about a lot of things that are in our orbit, but the difference between the two is our active role in the care process. So we can care about a lot of things, but we only care for a select few things. And I think this quote, which I love from Nell Noddings, who's done a lot of important work in this area, really captures that. The student is infinitely more important than the subject matter. So as experts in our disciplines, we certainly care about our subject and our content. But what Noddings is suggesting here is that is something different from caring for the student learners in our classrooms. And she's not advocating for breaking down any kind of personal boundaries that people aren't comfortable with. She's simply talking here about caring about our students and their learning. Are they learning as much as they could? If not, why not? Are they doing okay? You don't have to break down any boundaries you're uncomfortable with to do this kind of caring for students. And there are pedagogical strategies that are rooted, that are directly connected to this way of seeing students. And my argument is that while these are always important, they are more important now than they ever have been before. There's an urgency to a pedagogy of care that I don't think we have seen, certainly since I started working in higher education. So I want to mention a couple of resources and really look at what they are suggesting about these kinds of teaching strategies. The first is the caveat that often when we talk about emotion or caring or compassion or empathy, an initial response or an initial reaction to that means, well, we can't be both caring and also rigorous or have high academic standards, which is what I prefer to talk about rather than using the word rigor. Prefer to talk about having high standards in our classes. because rigor often is used as a kind of placeholder for discussions about gatekeeping and things like that. And so again, the response is often, I can't do both. I can't have high standards and be compassionate. That's simply not true. In fact, some of our most effective and efficient teaching strategies are also those that connect most deeply to these pedagogies of care, compassion, and empathy. And as I was talking about with the science of emotion, these are also teaching strategies that are evidence-based. They're connected and emerge from research on how we learn and how we design teaching strategies to effectively help us to learn. This comes from one of the best articles I know on the subject, The Pedagogy of Kindness by Kate Denial. And she really boils it down to these two things: believing people and believing in people. Believing people, trusting students, beginning our courses and doing our work as teachers with an ethos of trust, that our fallback position is to trust them and their work in the classroom, and to let them know that we trust them. That's not a message, systemically, that students are often sent in our school systems. So beginning with an ethos of trust, but also believing in them, letting them know through our course design, through our everything down to our interactions with them on a daily basis, let them know that we're rooting for them, that we are their coaches, that we are their cheerleaders, that we want them to succeed, that it is not our job to bar the doors and let only a few in. It is our job to help them to succeed, to help them to meet those high standards that we set. And in fact, that is those who study social belonging in the classroom have identified that as being one of the most effective and simplest things that we can do to help our students feel as if they belong and can succeed. And that is simply to give them that feedback that we have high standards, but we have every reason to believe that you can meet those standards. And that has had an outsized impact on the success of many students. So believing people, an ethos of trust, and believing in them, letting them know that we're there to help them, that we are rooting for them. And that at its basis is what all of these teaching approaches are about. And in the middle of at an inflection point in higher education like this, at a crisis moment, a student getting the message that they are believed and that that someone is rooting for them can go such a long way to helping them succeed. So over the break, I put together a variety of resources on course design and teaching that were rooted in these principles. I wanted to share, I talked with Dave briefly about this, and I wanted to share some of those that I found and talk about practically what does it mean to enact a pedagogy of care, or compassion, or kindness in our classes. Well, one thing is to strip away all of the kind of bells and whistles and to really think about what are our goals for this course that we're teaching. What do we want our students to achieve at the end of the semester? And if we that which is basic backward design, but also I think it takes on a kind of importance that goes far beyond a simple course design principle. If we can isolate and really boil everything down to what do we want students to achieve, we can determine what is vital for helping them to reach those goals and what is not. And that can help us strip away some assignments, for example, that may add burden without actually giving students or helping them to meet those goals. It can do a lot of things for us. But even beyond that, I have this screenshot from a James Lang article in the Chronicle a few years ago. We could even go further than this, not just what do we want them to have learned at the end of the semester, but what do we want them to remember about our class? What do we want them to have gotten from our class 20 years from now? What is it that is most important about what we are teaching beyond the near term, beyond the short term? What impact do we want our course to have on them in 20 years, right? And so if we think from that lens, that makes it even, kind of raises the stakes even more. What is vital to have in that class? What do we have to teach? And what is actually maybe impinging on that or is unnecessary to that, right? And this is rooted in a pedagogy of care, simply because when the stakes are so high, when we're in the middle of crisis, really stripping away those things that may be extraneous and getting down to your essential goals, your big questions, your course goals, that can really help us to advance our work. There are other things, using the syllabus as an instrument of kindness, a message of support for them, an antidote to inequitable practices. I know it's really popular to think of syllabi as contracts, but they can also be invitations. Yes, we have to have certain language in our syllabi. I know that it's been true of every institution I've worked in, but where we put that language and how we frame that language is totally up to us. What comes before it and what comes between it is also up to us. And our ability to use the syllabus as an invitation to the class into the learning that will happen, a welcoming into a learning community, a communication to students that, yes, we have high goals, we have high standards, but we're going to help you throughout the course of the semester to meet those. That I think is the important work of a syllabus. As the first experience that students will have of your class, it sets the tone for them, and it sets the tone for your work together, and it really is a baseline establishment of your teaching philosophy for them. And also developing policies that echo this care. Now, some of you were noting this in that first poll question: flexibility, flexible attendance, flexible deadlines for assignments, potentially, using our policies as a mirror for these values that we're expressing in the syllabus and our general pedagogical approach for the class. Now, the issue with some of these suggestions, though, is that we have to find a happy medium, right? One thing I observed last semester in my own classes and with colleagues at my university and other colleagues at other universities that I've talked to, many swung the pendulum on attendance policies pretty far over to either not having one or having a very, very flexible, very open attendance policy. But some experienced students not coming as often as they probably needed to in order to succeed. So balancing flexibility with accountability is sort of what I'm getting at, but more to the point, balancing flexibility with what we know will help them succeed in the class is really the key. Now, I don't have easy answers to that because every class is different and every approach to this is different. But I do think that that's sort of the target that we're aiming for. So what kinds of policies can we enact that really communicates to students that we're not just talking the talk, that our policies help them to see that we're walking the walk as well. Good. But all of this isn't easy. These are not the easiest pedagogical strategies in the world to implement. Some of them can add time, like the check-ins that were mentioned in the poll. That's extra time. Certainly it is important time that we are doing, but it is extra when you may not have done that before in classes pre-pandemic, or may have done it differently. And so some of these strategies will take extra time. So we have to think also about the workload of the faculty member, and the mental health of the faculty member, the work-life balance of the faculty member. So this comes from a blog post by Mahabali, who also writes a lot about the pedagogy of care. And as she says here, and I've been asked this question a lot too, what about the teachers? Who's caring about the people who are actually teaching? And she says that there are three kinds of care that faculty need as well. And those are, one, care from fellow teachers. So how are we being supported by, and how are we supporting our colleagues? What are we doing as departments? What are we doing as institutions to convey that to each other? We need care from our own students, and certainly that at the baseline that means having understanding from them. That just as they are going through a pandemic, so are we, and so having some understanding from them. But also, I heard a lot of stories from the fall about especially those who were teaching on campuses without mask mandates. For example, they would go into the class and they would ask their students and tell their students that they were caring for a child who wasn't yet vaccinated, or a parent who was immunocompromised, and could their students please wear masks for that reason. And so the kind of response they would get from students is a demonstration of whether students are giving them the care they need or not. And it matters. It matters whether or not you have to walk into a classroom every day and say, can you please pull your mask up? It matters whether or not they're understanding if it takes you a day longer to get them their exam grades back. That matters for our work. And finally, equitable caring policies from our institutions. A lot of you noted that. I know that early in the pandemic, we saw some of these that have now sort of trickled away. Policies about extending the tenure clock, for example, or using student evaluations differently in promotion and tenure, or at least putting an asterisk by them if they are being used in that P&T process. The grading scheme, lots of other deadlines made more flexible for our work as faculty. So I think that kind of care is important as well. And I don't want to leave this conversation without noting this, and indeed without discussing it. So what I'd like to do for the Zoom folks, I'm going to put you into breakout rooms for a second. For those who are in the auditorium, I just want you to talk to each other to the extent possible. So the question here: how do we strike a balance between the need for pedagogies of care in our classroom and our own trauma, grief, and exhaustion? What are some ways that we can teach effectively, but not burn out? So I'm going to put Zoom folks into a breakout room. Let's see, it is 1:11 your time. 6 minutes. So we'll come back together at 1:17. We'll put those breakout rooms together now. And you're just going to talk about those two questions. How do we strike a balance? How do we do this without burning out? Okay, I just opened the breakout rooms, and I'll send a message when it's time to come back. For those in the auditorium, just talk amongst yourselves. How do we do this? How do we strike the balance necessary? Okay. So yeah, everyone's on their way back. Would anyone like to share what your group talked about? Feel free to unmute. Anyone to share? What did you engage with? So if in order to do our best work, we need to pay close attention to ourselves and our level of grief and exhaustion and burnout as well. What did you all come up with?
So I can go for our group.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
And so we talked about the idea of being there to listen to the students, and just having an authentic conversation with them. And I think also the idea, and we talked about this a little bit, the idea of being willing to show our own vulnerability. And I think as you talked about that idea of trauma, because this is, these last couple of years have been traumatic for all of us. I should say for most of us. So.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. I think, Bell Hooks, who just passed away, talks a lot about the need to be vulnerable with students if we are asking them to be vulnerable with us as a core principle of effective teaching. And I think it's absolutely essential now. Someone put in the chat, someone in our group shared the NPR Life Kit series, 22 tips for 2022, which looks great. Thank you for sharing that. I think someone else was going to comment. Maybe one more person. Someone want to share? Okay, well, again, there are no easy answers here, but we have to keep our eye on this ball because, again, a lot of the spotlight has been on students for all the important reasons that we've talked about. And I think the push towards seeing students as full and complex human beings has been all to the good and has been necessary for higher ed. But we can't lose sight of the people who are teaching the classes and supporting the students at the same time, because the levels of burnout among higher ed faculty and staff are shooting through the roof. There's a book that will come out later this year from Rebecca Pope-Rourke at Georgia Tech on faculty burnout. We invited her to my university to not only talk to faculty, but to talk to our administrators as well about what it looks like, what can be happening. So what are the what will be the experience of witnessing the faculty burnout? How will it impact an institution? How will it impact individuals? So this is a serious thing, and I think we need to be paying close attention to it. So I want to just wrap up by noting that empathetic, compassionate teaching is also inclusive teaching. That this is another very important way that we connect with our students, that we show that kind of care, and that is by being inclusive. There are two kind of overlapping definitions of inclusive teaching that share many attributes, but are also slightly different in some ways. One is that inclusive teaching practices are designed to ensure that all students feel as if they belong to and are invested in our learning communities that we establish for them. And these are strategies that are really they are rooted in us and our work with the students that are in our classrooms, right? These are strategies that we can use that are directly connected to messages that we ourselves send about belongingness, and strategies that we ourselves can use for helping students to feel like they belong more. So that's one thing. Then we have this other definition that overlaps with that, and that is that inclusive teaching practices are also those that are designed to mitigate the structural inequities and opportunity gaps that have always pervaded educational systems. Now, these are things that no individual faculty member is responsible for, nor are those inequities things that can be undone by a single faculty member in a single course or even a single institution. But these are things that we need to be aware of if we are going to teach more inclusively and more compassionately. So some things that you're probably aware of that are out there connected to the research on helping students to feel that they're more a part of the learning community, welcoming strategies, for example, allowing students to record the pronunciation of their names, using names, simply using names is a research and evidence-based practice for helping students to feel more included. And for those who teach very large courses where memorizing names is impracticable, I think the research shows that it's not the memorization of the name, it's the using of the name. And so using table tense, any way that students can have their name in front of them so you can call them by name, even if you haven't memorized it. Social belonging interventions like wise feedback, which is that strategy I mentioned before of letting students know you have high standards and it's your job to help them meet those standards. Developing collaborative classroom compacts, in other words, working together to create some of those norms for behavior, norms for working together in small groups, norms for having difficult discussions. Attention to group composition for collaborative learning. The research shows that the most effective way of putting groups together for group work in order to mitigate bias is to put them together completely randomly. The more we allow students to choose groups for themselves, the more they will choose people who are like them in many ways, right? And careful development of syllabus and course materials to enhance representation. But I also want to just quickly note that second part of inclusive teaching, which is the mitigation of systemic inequities. So, for example, let's pretend we have two students, student A and student B, who are enrolling in SUNY Geneseo. They have similar GPA. So on paper, they look very much the same. However, student B has gone to a high school with fewer resources, with fewer books, with no AP classes, and with higher teacher turnover, which is often the case in schools with less resources. And it has always been true in American educational systems that state and local governments have often diverted more resources to historically white and wealthy communities and taken resources from neighborhoods and school districts that have historically been where historically marginalized people live. And so what happens then when fewer resources go to those schools is that those students experience what we call an opportunity gap. We used to call this an achievement gap, but even calling it an achievement gap placed too much of this blame on students themselves rather than the systems. So we call this an opportunity gap now because the students from the less resourced schools have had fewer opportunities to learn school, to learn the game of school, to experience high-level critical thinking activities, to have AP classes, to have honors classes, to have science fairs, all of that, right? And so they have encountered these opportunity gaps, and particularly in lower division courses, those students are often unintentionally penalized for having those fewer educational opportunities. In other words, the grades they get may have nothing to do with their talent or their abilities. In fact, often do not. What the grades in those early stages especially are measuring is how many educational opportunities they've had before entering into college. Those students are often labeled as unprepared, but in reality, the system has failed them. And so there are teaching strategies out there that can help bridge those gaps and mitigate the inequities. And I want to mention three very briefly, and then I'll turn it over for Q&A. On the upper left-hand side, you see Structure Matters. It's a great article by Kimberly Tanner. And in it, she talks about structured active learning. And what that is building in moments in a class time or as part of a class overall, where students have to ask a question that they have, or they have to articulate one thing that they know really solidly after the class session, one thing they're still confused by, remaining questions that they have. And the reason for this is because researchers have found that the students who need the most help will not ask for that help unless we intentionally structure the asking the questions into our coursework. Now, why won't they ask for help? A lot of different reasons for that, but sometimes they may feel as if they ask for help or ask questions, it may confirm a stereotype that a teacher has about them, or they may not know the hidden curriculum. They may not know that they can ask for help, that a teacher can be approached in office hours to ask for help. So structuring those moments where everyone has to, articulate confusion or ask questions helps all students, but it disproportionately helps students who have experienced opportunity gaps. The upper right-hand side of your screen, to the degree that our learning environments are more competitive, that means students competing against each other, the less inclusive those environments. The more collaborative, where students are working together, the more inclusive. And so the competitive pedagogical strategies really limit learning. We could go more into that in Q&A if you'd like. And finally, the idea of reconceptualizing how we assess participation. This comes from a paper from 2018. I really like this model. I've used it. I'm sort of an evangelist for this. But in it, Dr. Gillis looks at the dominant ways the participation has been assessed in the past. Either at the end of the semester, we sort of recollect how well a student participated in the class, which is ripe for bias, I think. And also another way that participation is sometimes graded is a point, students get a point for each time they participate. Both of those have serious issues with them. So she, in this paper, creates a new model where students develop 3 goals for themselves in terms of their participation over the course of the semester, and they self-assess their progress on those goals over 14 or 15 weeks, and their evaluation for participation is built primarily from their self-assessment. So a more inclusive way, a less potentially biased way of evaluating participation. Now, those are 3 of many, but I wanted to highlight the fact that some of the strategies that we need to use that are tied to compassion and care are actually also meant to mitigate some of those structural inequities. Now, all of this really gets to the heart of our work in the classroom at this moment, the needs of our students, and the reality for us as individuals for implementing them. So I'm going to leave this on the screen for you to think about. What is one thing we've discussed that you might be able to implement, and what will it take for that to be successful, just to help percolate. And I'm happy to open up for questions now. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Josh. That was a fantastic presentation. It was a great discussion that really emphasizes a lot of different points that we've been having in pockets throughout the university. So it's nice to actually kind of all get together and discuss it all at once. While I still have people here, I'd like to remind you that we have 2 more presentations going on, 2 more blocks of presentations going on for ASSESStivus. And please, those of you in the Zoom room, take a moment to fill out the evaluation form, and I'll open it up for questions. Feel free to pose those questions in the chat if you're on Zoom. We'll jump right in. So Josh, I'm curious what discussion is on your campus at Ole Miss, how people are trying to balance that being student-centered, responding to student needs, while not losing themselves in the process. Do you have any tips, strategies for your own campus?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think every campus is trying to find this out. I think, we swung pretty far over toward student needs early in the pandemic, and now I think we're trying to figure out, okay, well, where's the balancing point here? And so I have noticed a lot of discussion right off the bat this semester about attendance policies, as I mentioned. I think that the experimentation with flexible attendance policies also noted that many of the students who probably needed the most help also were the ones who didn't come as much as they could have in order to benefit from being together in the class, or whatever modality the class was taught in. And so how do you create an environment where students do not feel pressured to come to class if they're sick? You maintain a healthy environment without also sacrificing the learning that is that students can benefit from being there. And I don't have a magic formula for that, but I do know that depending on our learning goals, that answer is going to be either more flexible or less flexible. And it is completely okay to balance those two things together, that sometimes having students there when possible is vital, right, for the work that's going to happen. So finding the balancing act. I think some other questions that have really come up. What kinds of assessments are we giving? And so standard high stakes, 30% of the grade exams were put under the microscope at the beginning of the pandemic. And I think rightly. I mean, I think there's a philosophical, there are good philosophical arguments that we could have about that. But also the solution that was presented was alternative assessments, which take a lot of time in some cases to design and to grade. Now, their value in many cases can outweigh that time. But if we're thinking about the balancing point between faculty workload and student needs, that is something we have to think about really carefully. How can we extract from either type of assessment the most important learning goals for students, and how can we help students demonstrate that they've met those goals?
Thank you. Any other questions?
Okay, well, I hope you have the rest of the conference goes very well. I really appreciate the time that you all spent with me today, and good luck this semester with your students.
Jess, thank you very much for that presentation. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.